Hey, I'm Justin K. Hughes, licensed professional counselor. If you are wanting to know how to overcome obsessions, you're in the right place. I'm really excited to offer this free offering sponsored by my course, Christians Overcome Your OCD. No matter who you are, though, you're welcome. We're going to talk about skills, practical skills, and tools for overcoming obsessions here today. Thank you so much for joining. And to those of you that are going to watch later after the live here today, I want to share just a little bit of a background story. Charles, a junior high teacher who has these incredible abilities to analyze, incredible sensitivity, incredible thoughtfulness, just one of the kindest and sweetest people that you'd probably ever meet, honestly. And that's what most people think about him. And yet some days this mix felt like a curse, especially when he couldn't turn it off. So when he first started to have intrusive, unwanted thoughts, obsessions, later he was diagnosed with OCD. Well, he would spin on possibilities. He'd spin on terrible, awful things. After his baby was born, he was afraid that what if he wanted to harm his baby? If he had any anger around his child, it wasn't tolerable for him. So he would just get in his head really all day long. And so he found me through a lot of online searching, a lot of resources, many which were helpful, but many which weren't. And I come across this regularly as a therapist, folks who say, okay, it kind of makes sense logically. I'm kind of behind it. I know that I need to do some stuff with this, but what do I do? Just exactly how do I face my fears? How do I sit with difficult fears? Well, that's what this is about here today. But you'll know that something is from a true therapist when they give you disclaimers, because I want you to know the pros and the cons. I want you to know the limits. So I want to share with you here that all content is educational. I can't give you a diagnosis. I can't get your history and background. And there's so many factors that can really affect these things. So always seek the advice of your own health provider. It may not apply to everyone. So it's sponsored by my course for Christians. But I tried to make these available to anybody who would benefit from evidence-based OCD insights. But nonetheless, the information may not be for everyone. Additionally, there's pros and cons. There's a lot of access that we can get to things through education, but there's a lot that we can't do. And especially if you're suffering really severely, a lot of this may not just go over your head. You may be able to understand it, but it can be sometimes even more frustrating. So if you need help, please make sure to use these resources here on the screen. All right, very good. So once and about myself, Justin K. Hughes, licensed professional counselor. You can go to my website, justinkHughes.com, to understand more. I'm a therapist, I'm a speaker, I'm an advocate, I'm a writer. I'm all about helping people overcome their challenges in mental health and disorders and find hope. So let's talk about the basics before getting in really quickly to the skills. So first of all, when we're talking about obsessions today, when I'm talking about obsessions, yes, it's about OCD obsessions. So I could be obsessed with my car, which I kind of am. I drive a Toyota Prius. I love that thing. Make fun of me all day long. But there's a type of obsession that's there that it's the insider track of the knowledge, the interest, the nerding out, geeking out over certain things. But that's different than what we mean by obsession in OCD. We mean something very specific. So OCD obsessions are intrusive, they're unwanted, they cause distress, they're persistent. And examples of this can certainly be the classic contamination fears, or concerns of harm if I don't check the stove, or my curling iron, or my hair iron, or whatever it happens to be. But there also are intrusive urges, intrusive feelings, thoughts. This can be what if I have the urge to harm someone, and it can actually feel the same as an urge to do something else, like the urge to go for a run, the urge to punch a box, the urge, fill in the blank. So with intrusions in OCD, its starting point in the diagnostic train is that it's something that a person doesn't want to be around. And so when we talk about working with intrusions, I want to get really clear about expectations. We're not trying to change whether or not they exist, because you'd have to not be human, or you'd have to be brain dead, and that's probably not the goal here. So what do we do with it? Well, there are multiple methods that exist, but still to this day, the best research, best supported gold standard treatment is exposure and response prevention. And let me tell you, it works. It may not work perfectly for everyone, but it works still for most people. You may hear a lot of negativity about it, a lot of challenges, a lot of struggles. Get with people in the know who stick with you, who press in. There's a lot of working parts. Exposure and response prevention is facing a fear, and response prevention is removing those things that you do to feel better, but it makes it worse. There's safety signals for the brain. So if I am afraid that I'll get panicked in a social situation, this can show up in social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, but shows up a lot in OCD, then I may do a bunch of avoidant behaviors. I don't go to certain places at certain times, or I don't drink caffeine right before I'm about ready to go into a social setting so that my heart rate isn't increased, et cetera. These all reinforce the fear cycle. In an OCD, I want to share with you, basically here is what we consider the maintenance cycle of OCD. There's a few different ways to look at it. Yes, some different theories look at it differently, but it's a great just working method. And at the end of the day, we have to address some core things no matter what. So at the top, you see the intrusion. What if I could harm my baby? With OCD, it's not that the person is any more at risk of doing that, but they fear something like that. And so there's this threat interpretation, which causes distress, but then compulsions, which reinforces, after giving temporary relief, reinforces that that thing is scary. We call this danger learning. And so if that's the case, we need to have skills and tools that are different than reinforcing those problematic pathways, those ways that build upon fear. And something that I provide for free, if you, well, it's in my course. I also provide it free. If you go to my course and get the free trial, justinkhues.com/course. I'll have that link later. But my exposure and response prevention worksheet shows you at the top, there's always two parts to a basic exposure. And it's what you're facing and then what you're giving up. And today we're going to talk about the giving up side of things. What in the world do I give up? And this is where the big list of response prevention skills, the free guide that I have. So if you're here today, and many of you are here because you're a subscriber to my Get Unstuck newsletter or my course newsletter, either one is fine. And I'm going to send this for free later on today, so you have it. And we're going to go through step by step with a few examples. But in addition to this introduction, there's just a bullet point, or I guess it's a write-in list of, I think, about 100 different examples of things that you can do for response prevention. Totally free for you. Just go to justinkhughes.com/getunstuck or justinkhughes.com/course if you're interested in the course, and sign up for the free trial. Okay, so let's get into skills. Back to the example with Charles. And by the way, I use composite examples. It smushes together different examples. So yeah, Charles is Charles here. And if I've seen this example once, I've seen this example hundreds of times. And so I talk to a lot of advocates who share their stories. I read a lot of books, pull from different sources, so that I keep up privacy and confidentiality. So just so you know, with the story. With Charles, he had to really learn a lot of skills that worked for him. And no one skill works for everyone all the time. And that's the thing. It takes wisdom. I want to share a quote with you from a research paper, Masudo et al., 2004. Many of you know Stephen Hayes. He was on this research paper. And they talked about one of the skills that I'm going to jump into first, cognitive diffusion. All of these methods are complex packages containing many components. Even relatively focused procedures are not simple. Mindfulness, for example, includes acceptance, focusing on the present moment, taking a non-judgmental stance, attentional training, specific exercises, daily practice, and other elements. And so at the end of the day, there has to be a lot of wisdom to this. I don't expect any of you are just going to come away and say, wow, this healed me, this fixed me, this cured me. Please don't. That's going to be remarkably unrealistic and setting yourself up for a crash and burn failure. But when we learn these skills, find the ones that we can do, we can practice, and that start to make a difference, this is when there is this tipping point of movement in recovery. So wherever you are today, I want you to consider, some of the options of practicing all of these. Let me make this a little bit bigger here for you. See, here we go. That doesn't make it much bigger. Oh, well. So you'll have this whole guide, but I'm going to talk about cognitive diffusion. What is cognitive diffusion? Well, the concept itself has been labeled that more recently, past several decades. It's common in ACT, and I want to practice this here live. I told you there's skills, so I want to get you skills. Cognitive diffusion can involve a lot of different things. My absolute favorite is simply noticing a thought. So if actively distressed, if you're overwhelmed, distress coming out your ears, so to speak, this is going to be very difficult, near impossible. And I'm sorry to say, you're going to need likely therapeutic help, treatment services. You might even need more intensive services. Medication can help, a lot of things. But when you're able to practice this, you take the thing that you're feeling stuck with, because cognitive diffusion is about, first of all, noticing where a person is getting fused. So if I think walking away from work today, what if I did something wrong? What if I missed something? Even just for an example with me with this live stream, did I say things that were beneficial? Did I say anything that was wrong or incorrect? A lot of times that sort of train of thought gets pulled into just right OCD. And the compulsion can oftentimes be, looking down here at the bottom of the cycle, ruminating on those past examples, reviewing. And so response prevention is where I literally prevent that response. And some people may say you do nothing, but just so you know, doing nothing is something, because your heart is still beating, your brain is still functioning, you're still breathing. So you have to at least make a conscious decision to do this. So CDEF, cognitive diffusion, notices that thing, slows it down, and it labels it. I notice I'm having the thought, what if I missed something important in my live stream today? There you go. Starting with that. And here's where maybe even more of the real work comes in. You've got to stick with it. You got to stay with that for as long as is needed. And I recommend, with any skill, with any exercise, be intentional. Set a timer. Do it for 5 minutes. Do it for 10 minutes. And I'm going to come back to this. What if I said something wasn't helpful, said something incorrect? Okay. And I have to be careful, because I'm noticing myself even adding some additional thoughts to it. And part of the point of diffusion is to slow it down enough to not keep on adding on to that. What if I did this? What if I did this? What if I did this? But rather to come down to the core of what that is. And this is actually where exposure can join together really well. That's going to be for another day. We're in the response prevention camp. If these terms and these words don't make a lot of sense, feel free to check out my full-length free intro here on YouTube, ERP for OCD, where I introduce these concepts. And some of you may still struggle with it. And that's where you probably need that community treatment therapy provider, or just keep digging. Some of you are already doing that. Just keep going. It's not all going to make sense at once. It's taken me almost 20 years to get to where I am here, and I'm still learning. So back to diffusion. If you'd like to practice this with me, take one thing in your life that feels a little bit distressing right now. Maybe it's an obsession if you know you have OCD. And come back to that. I notice the thought. So notice that there's a little bit of distance, but you're not trying to force it away, because that can be another compulsion. But it's trying to unhook from defined meaning. So I don't know yet. I'm in the middle of this live stream. I don't know if it's helpful. If you like it, I don't even have the numbers in front of me. So I cannot answer that question. Do I feel a little distressed with that? Yeah. Anytime I get into some sort of a presentation or something where I'm performing, I play guitar for my church sometimes. I always have a little bit of baseline anxiety that can go up or down, but then it can really get hooked, stuck, trapped in this back and forth if I'm not very intentional with my skills. So back to the noticing the thought. One other way to practice cognitive diffusion is to thank the brain, thank your mind, practice gratitude for the thought. And this is hard to get behind if you have a thought that seems really unacceptable, which is one of the subtypes of OCD. Unacceptable thoughts, or harm thoughts, or violent, or sexual, or aggressive, or scrupulous, religious obsessions. Immediately people don't want to slow it down enough to say, oh, I had that thought. And by the way, sometimes people, and when I work with clients, we have to take 10 steps back and just have them start there. So wherever you are today, another way of practicing cognitive diffusion is to notice with thanks, with gratitude. Okay, mind, brain. For those of you that are Christian, you may notice it in a more of a spiritual way. God, thank you for giving me a brain to think thoughts, and I notice. So that would actually be adding gratitude to the cognitive diffusion. But I thank you for this thought. And how can I do that if it's a particularly vile thought? Like the thought, you want to harm your baby. No, I don't. No, I don't have to disprove. Again, if you're tuning in and you don't have OCD, that may not make sense. It's intrusive. It's against a person's wishes. So how do I say thanks for that thought? I say, thanks for the thought that I could harm someone. Because OCD plays on possibility. It plays on the thoughts and feelings that a person has that especially are unacceptable. And the more a person pushes that away and tries to get rid of it, first of all, that doesn't work. It's not how thoughts work. But secondarily, the more it just feeds that cycle. This is scary. This is scary. That's how we understand a lot of the fear cycle. We actually call that the getting rid of problem. The best description of this is from Reed Wilson, in my mind, who's written several books, but Stopping the Noise in Your Head is where he highlights this. He calls it the getting rid of problem. And it's like if you have something in your life, maybe it's a harm thought, maybe it's a not being good enough in faith, or being disobedient, or rejecting God, or going to hell, or getting a disease, or the examples are countless. Making a fool of yourself, doing a presentation. The getting rid of problem is as if the problem is here, and it's swinging on a pendulum. And if you try to push it away, it really, I'll add to what Reed Wilson said. He didn't nerd out in the the physics of it, but it has kinetic energy. Do y'all remember this from school? Bill Nye the Science Guy did a video on this. Kinetic energy or excuse me, potential energy. It's potential, but until you exert a force on it, it doesn't become kinetic energy. And so it's going to do what it's going to do. You may have that thought, you may have that distress, but it doesn't have to add more. If it can just be that, if it can just be like, oh, I don't like the thought of failure. I don't like the thought of harming others. Well, what if it's just that? That's cognitive diffusion. And one of the hallmark underpinnings of cognitive behavioral therapy is that a thought can be just a thought, and a feeling can be just a feeling. What if it doesn't have to say anything else? People will get tripped up regularly because so often, especially as humans, our feelings can be so driving towards an end result. If I feel, for me, now that I'm married, if I felt awkward on a date, did it mean that that person wasn't right for me? Could it just be at that moment that I have a feeling? And some of my listeners here today may say, well, what about when it actually is true? Or what about when I do need to assess these things? It's a different thing that we do at different times in different ways. So the key with a lot of these skills, and especially with response prevention, at the heart of it is to not do the compulsions. And it's done in endless ways. And practicing leaning into it takes time. You've got to stick with it. So back to thanking the mind as an example. Repetition is another way. We talk about this in exposure. So as a subset of cognitive diffusion, there can be exposure repetition, just like if I go to the gym and lift weights. I do. Have you noticed? The weightlifting, so to speak, is developing more discipline to lean into hard things. One of my friends, Kimberly Quinlan, says it's a beautiful day to do hard things. And it's how we grow. It's how we, even at times, like if I'm just lifting the same weight, I'm going to stay static. But if I build just a little bit more, I'm going to grow. And ERP is sometimes at best just getting our head above water. But then at some point, there's a tipping point where we go beyond just keeping things okay to growth and deeper recovery. So the repetition side of cognitive diffusion is to say it again, to repeat it, to say it in different ways. There's a type of cognitive diffusion that comes out of the old CBT, which was also called cognitive distancing, which is fine if you want to use it for other things. Don't use it for OCD. It's a tool that it tries to turn, it tries to make it so jokey, make it so silly that basically it pushes away the thought. And sometimes I get jokey, I get silly. You may see from my demeanor here, I'm very hands-on with people. I'm very, I'll drop a joke, I'll drop a reference, etc. And talk about a meme, a cultural moments, have a funny quote, say a joke. But this is part of life. And I do it in therapy when appropriate because that's a part of life. So one of the ways to do diffusion is to not push a thought away by needing to make it, I'm just going to joke. I'm going to say, what if I want to harm somebody? In a different voice. But instead to develop a greater response prevention, a greater mindfulness, a greater acceptance of that thought in that moment of saying, thought of harming somebody, thought of harming somebody, thought of harming somebody, thought of harming somebody, thought of harming somebody. These are different ways that we use tone of voice. We talk about this in exposure scripting, but I'm still just in the cognitive diffusion camp. Practicing it in a lot of different ways is one of the ways that we can do diffusion. Okay. as I already say, enough said, but there's really a lot more that we can cover. For the sake of time, let's come back to the guide here. Creativity. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. And I'm going to make sure to reserve some time here for comments. See that I posted a few that had been sent to me or shared with me in person. And then we also have, so by the way, go ahead and drop your questions here for those of you that are with me live. And if you're not with me live, you can still drop questions and I'll try to respond as able. So creativity, I'm going to pick that. Creativity. What are you talking about? Well, simply put, this also is another listed thing, change brain processing. So changing processing would be moving variables in our life so that our brain experiences it differently, I guess. I'm sure if any neuroscientists are watching this are cringing at my language, I'm sorry. But therapeutically, you may know these things as changing the room. There's what's known as the doorway effect, which is just a theory, hypothesis, but it's how something like walking through a different doorway can trigger different sensations, different feelings, like the kitchen. Have you ever noticed that before? You walk into the kitchen, you weren't necessarily thinking about food. Maybe you have to pass through the kitchen to get somewhere else. The next thing you know, maybe there's nothing on the table. Maybe there's no snacks or whatever laying out, but just drifting into the pantry or thinking, oh, it'd be really nice to make something. That's a bit of the doorway effect. And in cognitive behavioral terms, it's just classic associations. In learning associations, kitchen associated with food, the bed associated with sleep. Also, for those who struggle with various intrusions as well, many times clients will have a crossover of things such as intrusions about being able to go to sleep. I see in the questions, I'm going to get to that in a little bit about sleep. But then it starts to cross over with other things like contamination. Is the bed clean enough? Sexual obsessions as well. And these are just more examples of all the varied things that come up. If you can think it, OCD can latch onto it. If you can feel it, OCD can latch onto it. And so changing brain processing is a skill along with creativity that we know, and there's some excellent research that talks about how we process when we're creative. And the goal with this and with OCD, the goal always, there's not a lot of always that we're supposed to use in therapy, but the goal always is to not feed the OCD. And that's done through compulsions, and it's done through thoughts and beliefs and beliefs and interpretations. And so those are really the only couple of things that we can control. The top right and the bottom, that interpretation, compulsion, at least in the CBT model. So if those are the only things that we can control in that progression to actually affect things, we have to get to it. We have to work on that. And creativity is one of the ways to do it. So join me in a little bit of a practice. I'm hooked up here, so I can't actually grab my paper and clipboard. But one thing that I've started to do even more with my kids, I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. And we're doing a lot of things at any given point, but recently we had some canvases that a friend had left over, and both of my kids have been painting. Something that I hadn't done for a long time is painting and drawing, and so I've gotten back into that. So let's say if you have a distressing obsession, well, adding creativity into the mix, not to run from that obsession, but to change how you handle it, can be one of the many skills. Don't use any of these skills only, exclusively, rigidly. They have to be used flexibly. And that takes time, it takes practice, and it takes wisdom to know when and when not to apply. So with creativity, I don't know what you're doing. Feel free to drop in the comments what you like to do on the creativity side. See, Trevor C, thanks for putting this together. Absolutely. So glad you're here. And for me, I'm just going to take a moment. And this can be a little different to do on a video or a live stream, but I don't care because I think that this is important to do. I'm going to do some dead air. I'm going to do some silence for 30 seconds. And I hope you'll join me in the creativity side of drawing a little picture, drawing a little stick figure. And also I want to encourage you, take one of those thoughts that could be distressing as well. And don't try to push it away. Just let it be there as well. So for me, I'll just take the thing that is live and active for me, my inclination to judge my presentation, how I'm doing. Am I doing well enough? I'm going to hold that there. And I'm going to get creative. How I'm going to do it, since I don't have the pad and paper in front of me, is through a creative daydream of what I would like to do for lunch. And I'm going to hold that thought there at the same time. And you can borrow skills from other camps like cognitive diffusion. I may just notice that thought kind of floating through, but just letting that be there and creatively thinking, what could my lunch hour look like after this? All right, go with me, practice your creativity while also taking some thought that might be distressing to you. And we're just going to try this with just a little mock example. I'm not saying that you have to do this with your obsession, just anything. Okay, 30 seconds, go. See, I'm about 25 seconds. A mindfulness practice, you'll see mindfulness on this guide, is focus on a single minute. Dialectical behavior therapy talks a lot about mindfulness. It's one of the core modules of DBT. And I first learned this from them. Focus on a single minute. It's so easy to let time get away or to think that more time has passed when we're not mindful. Time flies when you're having fun. Well, that's okay. But if time has disappeared, well, of course, a person's not in tune with the time, which again is neither good or bad necessarily. But when we become mindful, we have this ability to estimate time just a little bit better. We'll see that in a difference of our behavior and day-to-day behavior as well. Not the least of which is day-to-day activities and how much time we need to get ready or leave to go somewhere. If you have a lot of compulsions, you may find that you very poorly estimate how long things will take. So back to the creativity side. So that was really interesting for me to do live here because I do very regularly feel that pressing in, that urge to evaluate, especially taking 30 seconds of silence during a live stream. I'm very self-conscious towards that. And so to practice some creativity of basically dreaming like, oh, okay, what would I like for lunch? And I thought about this really crisp apple that I'm going to have. I'm looking forward to it. That is an example of creativity. It's changing the way that I'm processing with my brain. But then when I noticed the thoughts of judgment, evaluation, concern, how's this going? Are people tuning in? Are people tuning out? I just come back, I'd come back, and I'd come back. And I commonly say to people that mindfulness is not the treatment of choice for OCD. We've studied it. We've researched it as a standalone, and it doesn't hold up to ERP specifically. It doesn't mean that it's not for you. Maybe it's the way that you go. It's totally up to you what you want to do with it. But I'll usually say that you can't do good OCD treatment without good mindfulness. And some of you, that will actually scare. That'll be distressing because you've associated mindfulness with something bad. For a lot of my clients, especially with ADHD, they envision just getting really silent for a long period of time, which sounds like noise screaming in the ears. For clients with scrupulosity, that may be tied to a different religious belief or system or practice or discipline that they're either unfamiliar with, and it seems like they're doing maybe something wrong if they do mindfulness. And simply put, it's just being present-minded. So mindfulness is really, at some level, I would say, an essential part at its heart, even though people do successful treatment without doing full modules and trainings on mindfulness. Back to response prevention and what that is. Originally, they were using rat models to understand response prevention. And you know what the response prevention was when they were trying to train a rat to do something different? It was a little board, a literal board that they would put down to block the rat. It's something you don't do, but done in many ways. So you'll notice B, B-E, as in just be in the moment here. And it takes a lot of training, a lot of practice to do that, and something that's going to be a lifetime of practice for me and also most of my clients. To be sometimes is harder than to not. As to this train of thought, I think that Dr. Michael Greenberg has a lot of good information. There are some things that I do a little bit different in the day-to-day, but he talks about rumination particularly, and how to not solve a problem. So he uses the metaphor of, if you have a math problem, to put your pencil down and to not solve it is the passive thing to do. And you can actually do that. And it's a great metaphor to use for this, because we can learn to not keep solving the problem and feeding the OCD cycle. And a lot of times people just have to learn that their thoughts are actually, their thought processes are the behavior. I'm spinning on this. If you've shown up to this video, that could be you, because you may be needing extra skills for thoughts specifically. So back to the creativity in changing how you process. I also want to jump into one last one on the guide. It's on the, well, technically third page, but first page of the listings. It's what we call attention versus awareness. And then I'm going to open up for some questions here. So there is a difference between attention towards something and our awareness about something. And a lot of what I'm talking about here today, and a lot of the examples that I'm showing you are about, it stands on this platform. And when we study in the research, and for us as practitioners, especially of cognitive behavioral therapy, attentional training is a really important part of working with thoughts. Let me give an example with the social obsessions. If I walk into a social situation and I feel distressed, and I notice the thought, I feel afraid, that's the feeling, and I notice the thoughts, nobody likes me. There's a lot of ways to approach that and a lot of tools to approach that. But one thing is the attention versus awareness. What am I putting my attention on versus what am I aware of? And people with both social anxiety disorder and OCD with social obsessions have this attentional bias, as it's called in the research, to focus on certain exclusive details. That's how fear works. Fear narrows focus. And when we get out of fear, when we get into recovery, it actually opens up that focus. So attention versus awareness is the ability to practice and to notice and do this as a person goes throughout their day, how to place their attention on something, but then how to just notice and be aware. So back to my example, I'm aware of maybe 100 things that I could list that could go poorly about this presentation. I could probably list 100 things that could be positive and go really well. But I'm not doing what's called cognitive restructuring. I'm not trying to challenge myself with what's true, with what's real in this moment. Response prevention, one of the skills that we can use is as a subset of mindfulness, being present-minded, attention versus awareness, practicing. Okay, what am I putting my attention on? And what am I aware of? Attention, awareness, attention, awareness. It takes a lot of practice. You have to do it at moments when you're not very distressed to learn it, as with most things. And so I'm aware of my keyboard right here. And I hadn't paid attention to that this whole time because I'm not using it. Okay. But it might start to, I might start to put my attention on it if I have a concern about contamination, when I've spilled food on it before, or maybe I need to clean that up so that I don't damage it. There's a lot of reasons why things can shift, but the practice, especially with obsessions, is learning to notice and go back and forth between the attention versus awareness. And part of where the wisdom comes in is understanding what is the valuable thing to put our attention on. And that takes time. It takes practice. Breaking it down in small, doable ways is crucial. Okay. Let's jump into some questions. So I'm seeing here in the comments, just a couple of the ones, let's see, to review, actually. Bear with me one second. All right, so Molly Moon Mon, if I am pronouncing that correctly, how do you deal with sleep and OCD? Sorts that almost sleeping, but still awake feeling, and bad thoughts. It's hard to combat that in the place of vulnerability. Yeah, that's really, really hard. When sleep is affected, it has its own unique difficulties. People can feel like the difficulty is the greatest. C.S. Lewis had said something along the lines, I think this was in his book, The Problem of Pain, that my pain and suffering right now is the greatest pain and suffering in the world. It was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's a bit honest too, that it's what I know. And so if you're feeling very alone, know that you're not, but also know that that pain is still valid, whatever that is. The sleep and OCD, that has some very unique ways that it shows up in very similar ways to other things. So there could be a lot here. So since you're asking about sleep and OCD a little bit more broadly, and bad thoughts, I'll go kind of broad. If I see a clarifying question here, feel free to clarify that. I can touch base on that. But sleep is a result of multiple processes coming together. And it's kind of something that happens to you when you're doing the things that facilitate sleep. And so with OCD, it tends to really latch on to the, what am I doing? And I've got to make sure that it's a certain way, and bad thoughts, and I got to control these. And so believe it or not, though a lot of people may think you can't do exposures before you go to bed, it's going to amp you up, fill in the blank. Okay, there's some things that I will work with some nuance in to do or not do at certain moments. But at some point, the part of the loop, back to Kimberly Quinlan, I saw that she had a post of sleep, specifically the sleep cycle and OCD. It's basically like if you have intrusions, obsessions about sleep, and the interpretation is I won't sleep, or I can't have these thoughts, or whatever else, I would look a little bit at what are those thoughts? What's the fear? What's the core fear about that? And then especially, looking at, you can't see this whole dynamic there, but looking at what do you do? Because at the end of the day, regardless of the definition, the diagnosis, if we take an understanding of fear and how fear is maintained, just generally speaking, anything that feeds the thought process, or so the mental rumination, the review, the checking, anything that feeds that in the thoughts that this could be bad or scary, in any behaviors overtly or mentally that avoid doing things that you need to be able to face, will reinforce that. So oftentimes we're doing various exposures for sleep. And we may also be doing some general CBT, depending on how impacted a person's sleep is. So paying attention and tracking sleep. Do I go to sleep at different times? Am I not being realistic about my sleep schedule? Am I consuming substances before I go to bed? Caffeine, alcohol, fill in the blank. There's a lot of great things to do there. But I would say, especially for this video here today and what we're talking about, my biggest point with this is that it's hard. You're not alone. And third of all, really finding out what are the things that are done, whether it's mentally and or tangibly, in reaction to any of those bad thoughts or fears with sleep. Clarifying that's going to be really, really key. And a person who has OCD and in treatment will probably need to do exposures, probably need to tackle how they're playing with their thoughts, learn a lot of those response prevention skills, not the least of which could be the attention versus awareness, cognitive diffusion, mindfulness, changing brain processing, etc. And again, one thing doesn't work all the time for everyone. Even one person, it doesn't work all the time. But it may be a mix and match of those things. It just can't be any one of those things that's used to demand or control sleep, because that's not how sleep works. By the way, my favorite resource on this is Dr. Stephen Phillipson on the OCD Stories podcast, Sleep as the Hostage of Anxiety. Fabulous. I hope that's helpful for you. Okay, so moving on, comments. One other that I want to make sure to get to time-wise, since it was asked by one of my subscribers. Oh, here we go. When your contamination fear feels like you're dying and it takes days for the fear to dissipate because you couldn't clean anything and thus were forced to do ERP, even though you know Hebrews 2:15 is true in your head, how do you rest in Psalm 91? Okay, great. So if you don't know those passages, Hebrews 2:15, Psalm 91, I'll actually go back to the core of the question here. Sorry, I split that up. Or if you're not Christian or whatever, that may not make sense. But let me cover that briefly. In the Bible, Hebrews chapter 2 has these warning passages. And if there's something that we're supposed to be warned about, that's important. OCD involves a faulty alarm system, though. So just to be clear, if you have OCD, and if you have OCD about spiritual things, we call it scrupulosity. It will focus on these types of things. And the feelings and the thoughts feel just as real as if it's real. People can't tell the difference. Clients tell me this regularly, all the time, that the emotion that they feel when they have an obsession, they can't tell the difference between emotions that they felt when the situation actually was real. And it's part of why OCD feels so real. We can get into the neuroscience of it, that it pertains to really similar regions in the brain as ... But at the end of the day, it's important to call out the cycle. Come back to the cycle. What is keeping this alive? So Hebrews 2:15 is this: deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. So it's a passage on fear of death, and can be easy to have a lot of obsessions about this, that, oh, if I'm a Christian, I shouldn't fear death. And there's other passages in scriptures that talk about we don't mourn like those with no hope. A lot of passages on fearing death as well. And so If there are obsessions and intrusions, it can look a lot of different ways, like, oh my goodness, maybe I don't actually believe, maybe I don't actually trust, fill in the blank. And my role on the ERP side or on the therapy side is to, one, point the person to um, uh, their community and the scriptures and the values and so forth, but to be very careful. And this is where clergy get tripped up on this. They oftentimes will just come in real quick. Well, here's a reassuring Bible verse. My goal is not to do that, but to say, well, hey, where are you spinning on this? Where is the obsession? Because that's what needs the work. We're focused on the wrong thing if we're just quoting other verses that seem to neutralize that. In an OCD, that becomes a compulsion. So if I'm understanding the question right, how do I take that in light of Psalm 91, which Psalm 91 starts like this: He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust, for he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. He'll cover you, ... Under his wings you'll find refuge, ... You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day. So it goes on. There's 16 verses in Psalm 91. And so if I'm understanding this correctly, how do I take that in light of both of those? Well, first and foremost, let me point you back so that I don't give you reassurance. If you actually know the theological answer, or you may not feel like you know the theological answer. If you've been given an answer to this, but you find that you're spinning, I don't want to just give you another quick answer, because I can share with you what I think and what I believe theologically about that passage. But if I'm reading between the lines, the more important thing here might be to tackle some unacceptable thought or fear that for many people looks like, if I'm afraid of death, what if I'm not taking shelter? What does that mean? Okay. So first and foremost, if an exposure is developed with this is education, not saying it has to be for you. I'm just trying to guess between the lines here. Might be, oh, I have this feeling of guilt, sadness, shame, fear. I have the thoughts I might not be of the faith. And that would be terrible, awful. Okay. And then if this is what you're spinning on and compulsing on, then that's what would have to be done, or that's what you'd have to do business with, and find a lot of different ways to practice the most important part of it, which is not actually the exposure. The exposures are important, but to practice response prevention, which is not giving into it. Because if you're giving into it, you're keeping it alive. You're giving oxygen to the fire. So I hope that helps. Hope it's useful. So yeah, three other questions that I think I can get to here in 7 minutes. Any updates on the book? Oh, thank you. That's so sweet. As you would have it, this coming weekend, and those of you that pray and are willing to pray for me, I'm doing a writing retreat weekend to finish the content. I put it on hold so I could do my online course first. And so I'm working on finishing up the gist of the content here while I pitch to agents and publishers. So thanks for asking. Okay, so questions here. Thanks for all you do. Thanks. Yeah, happy to do it. What tips do you give for mental rumination? Well, today, and depending on when you joined, I saw the question kind of middle of the video, so feel free to go back to watch the whole thing. And let me see if I can give something though specific for what I think might be being asked here. With mental rumination, it can feel so helpless and hopeless, and it's so difficult to not spin. And so first of all, the starting point that I like to begin with is that mental rumination is a behavior. It's something you do. And if it's something you do, it is theoretically something you can not do. You just have to learn how. And the ways to do that are many and varied. Thus, we're talking about today. and takes a lot of wisdom, a lot of practice. I've said all of these things several times here today. But simply put, if you call it out and you recognize that you're ruminating, so one, know that it's behavior. Secondarily, you call it out. Tracking is really important. And even sometimes I'll use the classic CBT skill of just writing. That's on the list here. Writing, what? It's last page because it's the W. There we go, writing. We can do tracking and monitoring. Oh, yep, it's on there too. Because sometimes if we write down the problem, it's part of the difference in brain processing. It is different when we write that down. And it doesn't mean that it's not compulsive, and that's where we have to be really careful. We're not just saying, oh, journal your thoughts and feelings. A lot of people have done that, where they go to somebody who says they're CBT or are general CBT, but don't understand OCD. And with mental ruminations and OCD, people will get tripped on all of the assessment. And it can actually look like they're amazing at homework, amazing at spiritual life, etc. And they're just really mentally ruminating. So recognizing mental rumination as a behavior and calling it out. And then otherwise, I'm always writing and speaking on that topic and then working with clients directly. So stay tuned for more. Okay. What if the fear is that the obsession won't end? Kind of like a meta OCD morphed with a theme. What do you suggest? Yeah, thanks. Great examples. Oh, yeah, we're blown up here with more questions. I see them popping in. Or maybe, yeah, blowing up for me, at least. I love to see multiple questions on these. So, yes, one of the core fear themes is suffering, and particularly never ending suffering. And this actually kind of takes two forks. So some people have it in more of a temporal sense that I'm just going to suffer and suffer and suffer. So it could show up more like OCD. It can show up in sensory motor or sensoromotor hypersomatic obsessions. Like, what if I can't stop focusing on a part of my bodily process? And then meta OCD is meta is thinking about thinking. And so getting stuck kind of in that stratosphere, so to speak, of assessing and evaluating and noticing themes and perspectives rather than the specific thing. And exposures are still really useful for all those, including sensory motor, including meta OCD. They just have to be pointed based on proper assessment. And mindfulness is still really important, but it just has to be pointed based on proper assessment. So if the obsession is it won't end, let's see, morphed with a theme, I'll just make one up here. So you're not saying this, but a common one can be that I am okay with tolerating today the thought that what if I lose my mind and go crazy? And this could be, what if I become a serial killer? What if I turned into a pedophile? What if I turned into a baby killer? What if I turned into it? Again, OCD just plays on really anything. Take a thought, and if you can be afraid of it, OCD can latch onto it. And so going crazy is often a fear of, will this always continue? Because a lot of people can tolerate a moment in passing, walking away from a social situation, walking away from a presentation where they feel crazy. It's like, oh man, yeah. And maybe something negative happens at that event and people are like, yeah, I don't think we're going to have you back to speak, or thanks for sharing, but we'll go a different direction with the next one. You can actually have something that is difficult, but you're able to move on a little easier. But oftentimes the obsession can be, I'm always going to be thinking about something, always going to be focused. So maybe I could deal with it for a day, a month, a year. But Justin, if you tell me that you have to accept, tolerate the uncertainty, I don't know if I can do that. But see, the trick is this, that habituation, which is feeling less distressed, or particularly a certain change in distress after being exposed to something, a stimuli, a trigger, etc., is a scientific principle. It is biological fact. As humans, the feelings that we feel are never exactly the same all the time for the rest of our life. And so one thing to start with is that the feelings will change. They'll go up and down. And I can't guarantee you that you wouldn't be in perfect recovery, full recovery, and you wouldn't have a really hard day or really hard week because of these things. But here's the trick is that if you're able to practice acceptance that is there for as long as it has to be, the irony is that it tends to show up less. And people do habituate, but no one is guaranteed just how much exactly when. And back to the sleep side of things, this is where people try to control it at a certain moment versus showing up. And I oftentimes say that that's part of that faith leap that's maybe not always directly spiritual. You may actually think of it in a directly spiritual way, and it may link to directly spiritual things, but it's kind of just a general leap of faith. Okay, can I actually face this, tolerate it, sit with it, even if it were never to end, and still live my life? And it's easier said than done. If you're struggling with this and with the sleep, etc., it's so hard in the moment. Hear me loud and clear. But there are plans, there's strategies, and I hope I don't have a specific example of what the theme is, but hopefully that's that covers that. Repeating the resource on sleep, absolutely. That is, I'm going to drop it here. OCD Stories podcast. Dr. Stephen Phillipson. Sleep as the hostage of anxiety. And he covers general anxiety too, but he's an OCD specialist. Very good. So that's in the comments. Okay. And I'm looking here. So I'm technically at time, but I want to keep going. Do I keep going? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I just got to keep going. Just a little bit here. And I'll do an end. Would like to just play a quick intro video for my course and close it out. Also remind you guys of the free thing that you're going to get here today if you're subscribed. So stay tuned just for a few more minutes here. Or if you're not watching live, scroll to the end. So let's see. How would you go about ERP? I've had a cold sore and it's debilitated me. Depressed from family. Haven't worn makeup. Left the house. Went neat. Family. Basically, fear paralyzed for the last 2 weeks. Well, okay. So right off the bat. Feeling paralyzed for the last 2 weeks. If I were sitting with you, that's what I would do. And I think of the book of Job, where the friends did really, really well when they sat in that suffering. So I take some moments to really sit with that and just kind of be, because those things just are so, so difficult. I'm not exactly sure what the cold sore ERP is about. Unless if it is the spreading or the fear of spreading, that would be my best guess based on what you shared. I'll just go with that. No, let me zoom back. Instead of going with that, let me come back to the general theory. So if you have OCD and you're wanting to understand the gold standard treatment, we have to understand that cycle of OCD and what do we do in response to that. And the ERP worksheet talks about that generally. But if you're finding yourself debilitated for a couple of weeks, you're going to need a lot of help, most likely. And I don't mean that as a negative. I mean that as a positive in a supportive sense. These things need a lot of support and assistance, because if you're feeling debilitated, no one is going to be able to get all of the resources that they need. And when we talk about these skills, we have to practice them at moments where we're not just completely overwhelmed. But we have to come back to the basics of what what are we trying to do here? So I think that there's a lot there. And so the most important thing for me today is to just appreciate that. I'm really sorry you're going through that. You're probably going to need that additional support therapeutically. Hope that's helpful. Okay. Have you ever seen reading be an issue for people with OCD, like having a constant hard time reading and not remembering? Yeah. So if that's not a reassurance question, reading, think of it this way. I'm not going to say exactly what everybody goes through, but let's go back to the OCD cycle. If my concern, my fear, my interpretation is related to reading or memory or concentration, what happens when we focus on something with fear, or we've had a lot of compulsions, or we're debilitated, as Janelle was sharing there? There is a huge study, I believe it came out of Yale a number of years ago, that answered a lot of questions pretty definitively that many of us professionals wondered about. Were there impacts on concentration and memory and attention? Yeah, absolutely. And the simple way of describing that as a therapist is that a lot of things get missed when there's a lot of fear. And so that happens. Now, can there be other underlying things? Yeah, there's a lot of what we call comorbidity with ADHD, learning differences, etc. And so sometimes it can be those things. But if it's something that's more temporal and it doesn't seem to be lasting since childhood or whatever else, those things go up and down in different ways. Another question, Janelle, how beneficial is medication versus ERP? Really want the story to be God healed, and I was able to surrender and lean on him. Yeah, so I get that. So let me just give the stats that about 20% of people will say, nope, I don't want ERP. Out of those that say, yeah, I'll try it, maybe about 20% will drop out. So out of the people that are willing to try it, 80% stay in. And then this is of adults. The numbers vary with some other factors, severity. They differ based on age. Children get just a little less benefit, but have a tendency to experience remission more than adults, which is really cool. Treat it early, treat it young, for those of you who have a young person or are a young person. So ERP, on average, in a lot of studies, reveal up to 60 to 70% improvement with a trial of exposure and response prevention. That's pretty wild. Pretty wild. Mileage may vary. ERP, on average, about 30 to 40% symptom improvement for 40 to 60%. So roughly half of people will take the edge off, basically. And this is important to say, especially this is sponsored by Christians Overcome Your OCD, and I talk about this in my course. It's not I would be more faithful if I didn't take medication or didn't rely. There are a lot of tools that are part of what we call common grace. A lot of tools that if I take ibuprofen for my headache, Advil for my headache to help me through the day, am I not relying on God or not relying on strength building? That's another example. It's kind of more of a perfectionism or a performance thing a lot of times for people that I talk to. So whether you struggle with it in a spiritual sense, or even if you just think of it in a performance sense, come across that a lot. What if it can be a both and? What if it's there for our good and a substance that can help us? That's the way that I look at it. And I do a deep dive in the rationale for treatment in my course as well. All right. So looks like a great place to wrap us up here. Want to thank you so much. Please note in the comments if you are interested in any additional videos. I will be doing more. I plan to. And the big list of response prevention skills. So what I was covering, this goes out to you who are my subscribers here today. So if you're not a subscriber, now's your chance. Go there to the bottom, justinkhues.com/course, or you can also be a subscriber through, you'll see at the bottom there, justinkhues.com/getunstuck. That's my practice, my articles, my events, etc. Whereas the course is specifically those interested in the course, and you get different things there too. So it doesn't matter, wherever you're subscribed, you'll get this free resource here today. as a part of this. So really glad that you're here. So I'll play the video here in a second and then wrap up. But again, thank you for the time. It's just such an honor and a privilege to be with you. It's you and people that I work with every single day that motivate me, inspire me, have helped me to learn so much, and hopefully help many more. Hope you have a great rest of your day. OCD is isolating, debilitating. It's one of the most debilitating illnesses on the face of this planet. And it can feel even more alone as a Christian to suffer with it if there's an expectation of needing to just have more faith or pray more, or somehow this wouldn't be a problem if I just trusted in God more. Well, I want to encourage you, it's not a weakness of faith. It's not a specific faith issue. However, people who grow deeper and mature more find that oftentimes their faith is at the center of it. I've worked with hundreds of cases at this point of OCD and talked to even more people about their experience, ranging from Pastor William, who suffered with scrupulous obsessions of whether or not he was saved, to Susan, who was an attorney, now a stay-at-home mom, who had obsessions of what if she harmed her kids accidentally. She didn't want that, but she had these intrusions, and many, many more. And I think the most important thing for you to know up front is that there's hope and there are steps forward. And that's exactly what I want to show you. I want to show you how. I want to get into the logistics. This course helps people walk the road of understanding how do I find freedom in OCD, and also while walking faith congruently with Christ.